All right. Welcome, everyone, to today's episode titled Creating Connection, where we'll talk about how we can create connection with our team while performing to our highest potential, all while being authentic at the same time. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Jordan Bauer. Jordan, thanks for joining.
Pleasure to be here, Damian.
Yeah, it's an interesting story, kind of how we got here today. Maybe before we jump into your story, I can give a little context for anyone listening. Jordan came in and kind of did some workshops with the organization I used to work for previously. And at that time, I would say you were someone that I kind of looked up to in this space. And, you've been in this space for a while. So with that, maybe I'll let you tell your story to kick things off. If that works for you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so once upon a time, I graduated from business school and I had that problem that lots of people maybe like us had at the time where I went out into the workforce and I couldn't find anything that was quite right for me. I was a creative thinker. I was really interested in emotions and connection. And I grew up in a world where none of that stuff existed in business. If you were doing that kind of stuff, meaning you're thinking about communication, connection, emotion, you were either in marketing or you were in HR.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so I went out, I got a job in my early 20s, found myself really frustrated. And then when I was about 25 or 26, I had what I called a quarter life crisis, where I quit my job, broke up with my girlfriend at the time, packed everything I owned into a backpack, not really everything I owned, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I spent more or less the next 6 or 7 years traveling the world. And so
Wow.
over the course of that 6 or 7 years, I went to something like 40 different countries. I spent 2 years backpacking in India. I spent
Wow.
a year by myself walking down the west coast of America from Canada to Mexico. So I did a lot of
Wow.
pretty weird and crazy, can I swear?
Yeah, yeah. You're
Shit,
good. Yeah.
yeah. I did
Yeah.
lots of crazy shit and had a real opportunity to kind of counterbalance the formal technical business education I had with this other education into relationships and emotional intelligence. And if I can even say this, like spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
when I kind of came back to the world, which was in 2013, so about 10 years ago, I really challenged myself and was challenged to try to figure out like, how do I put these two things back together? I had on one hand this hard, like technical understanding of what business is and is supposed to be. And on the other hand, I had this understanding of people. And so gradually, what I started to develop language around was this term called storytelling. And I think, especially in those early days in business, storytelling meant something very concrete, very, how would I say this, strategic narrative focused, but also very tactical. What's our sales narrative? What's our marketing narrative? What's our vision and our mission? And I think what I noticed at the time was it was the advent of social media. So whereas once upon a time organizations were very focused on, just one brand message that would go out and everybody would beat that drum, suddenly that message was starting to fracture. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
meaning that now it's you can't just have one message when you're posting on Instagram every couple hours, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
got
Oh,
to be
totally.
diverse, it's got to be engaging. And I started to see an opportunity in organizations to explore at a deeper level, what does engaging communication even look like?
Mm-hmm.
So over the past 10 or so years, I've done workshops with lots of organizations. I've worked with big organizations like Autodesk, Mozilla, which are like massive tech companies. I've
Mm-hmm.
worked with governments. I've worked with the Federal Reserve Bank of the US. I've worked with like a lot of different style of organizations and individuals and nonprofits and all kinds of things,
Mm-hmm.
because I think there's something really core about communication that can apply broadly across all those categories. And so my work has been something that's been very creative, very dynamic, very fun. And I would also say very improvisational, which basically means like, I don't know where the fuck I'm going to go tomorrow. And that actually is, in tech language, that's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? Because
yeah.
it's allowed me to bring a much different ethos to the way I approach this work than I think a lot of folks who are working in the space bring.
Mm-hmm.
Just to kind of pin a point on that, I think a lot of people are very focused on this is the right way to do things. And my strategy or my ethos in a nutshell is it depends. It depends on what I want. It depends on what the stakeholders want. It depends on the circumstances. And all of that, even if we figure out what works today, could change by tomorrow. And so I'm very interested in how organizations and people work in this much more dynamic world.
I love that. And I can't help but be a little bit biased with this travel piece because I also did a lot of traveling kind of earlier and continue to do so. But I did a few big travel stints earlier in my life as well. And I think that you are forced to become aware, become flexible, become okay with failure because those things will happen when you're traveling, especially on your own. I'm sure you have many stories where things didn't go as planned and you had to kind of go with the flow. And that probably, as you know, shaped and molded that ability, that elastic band analogy, to be able to come back to baseline frequently. And I feel like I can't help but think that. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that too.
I mean, I think you're totally right. And I would say, like, looking back on the education I got as, like, like a white guy growing up in Canada,
Mhm.
like one of the things that I used to kind of bemoan when I was in my late teens is like, this is the most privileged thing to say, so just bear with me.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
All the problems of the world have been solved. There's, and we got educated to believe that, like, life was already in control, and all you had to do is fit into the system, and sure, you can, innovate a little bit at the edges, but you never really questioned the integrity of the system, meaning the economic system, the social system, like all those things. I grew up in an environment where I was told that the way I was doing those things was the best way that has ever existed in the history of the world. And so what travel started to do for me is it really poked a hole in some of those baseline assumptions. Like, I traveled in places that were, for example, way poorer or lived in way worse social circumstances. And yet there were these emotional feelings of society and community and such that were there that really challenged anything I had ever experienced.
Mhm.
And it's not to say that one was better or worse, but it was more to say, personally, for me, I really had to step back and reevaluate, like, is what I was taught actually right? And I think going and experiencing life in these different places, it pulls you outside of what your normal is and forces you to kind of come back and reconsider, you know,
Mhm.
what you actually think.
Mhm.
The greatest trip, and you probably know this, but the greatest trip isn't going, but it's coming home, because you've had all these experiences, and now how do you reintegrate all of that into, like, day to day?
Yeah, that hits home for me when I was 18. After high school, I chose to do a Rotary exchange to Brazil. I was this white suburb kid that grew up in a community that was very much people staying in that town their whole life. This was kind of, the life you wanted was kind of out in front of you. I was very close-minded, hadn't traveled much at all. The rule with the Rotary Club was you're not allowed to visit or really engage much with your family or friends back home because they feel like it takes you out of that immersive experience. So I had this full year, which, Brazil at that time and still is a country with all kinds of stuff going on. And we could go into that, but there's a lot happening there. And I came back, I'll never forget, I came back and it was unfortunate circumstances. The day I landed, I was expecting my parents to be there, but it's just like my dad, and he's like, your grandpa died yesterday. We got to go to the funeral. So this is my arrival back and integration back
Wow.
into this world. And I struggled to adapt initially. And my parents kept saying, you went away a boy, you came back a man. And I really struggled, to be honest, with going back to kind of what I was doing. Even some of the friends I had been hanging out with, like nothing had changed really when I came back. And it really got me thinking, and it opened my mind. I use the analogy of, like, you take a fish out of a pond, you put it in the ocean, and you try and put it back in the pond. It's seen so much, it's tough. So I can relate to that big time. But I think that has also allowed me to apply a lot of those principles into the workplace, into my career, about thinking bigger, thinking differently. So that was the best experience for me, in my life to date for that. So I can definitely relate to that.
I mean, I remember an experience where I did a couple months of volunteer work in a desert in India,
Mhm.
where, like, water was such a precious resource that when you were washing dishes, you were allowed to turn on the tap for, like, basically a second, wash it with your hand, right? Because you're in a drought situation, and so you couldn't, And then I came home and I remembered the absurdity of taking a 25-minute shower, where, like, again, like, the
Yeah.
circumstances are so different, but, when you've swam in the ocean, you can see differently. And I think, like, to bring this into business for a second, like, one of the things that I think at the time that I traveled, and maybe the time that you traveled too, which was like early 2000s,
Mhm.
it was still a disconnected world in
Yeah,
that,
no
like,
phone. I didn't have a phone.
I didn't have a phone, but I remember if I wanted to send an email home, I would have to go to cyber cafes.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You'd
Yeah.
have to pay by the hour, and you would get this terrible dial up. And I can still remember, like, waiting 45 minutes for that initial Hotmail screen to show up. You have 17 emails, click another 45 minutes, and it would never arrive. So I was really like, it was a time before the world was webbed together in the way it so obviously is now. And so I really felt, and maybe naively, that I had this responsibility to my community, to my friends back home, to, like, go out into the world, see, and then bring back,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
like, we can pull apart the bias in that assumption. But the point being, like, at that time, most of the people that I knew hadn't been to, the places that I had been to, because you couldn't just jump on a plane, go to Thailand, have your phone and just navigate around. But I think what's interesting now is, like, now all of us, not just in terms of travel, but in terms of access to the world through social media, through the news, et cetera, have these very different oceans of experience.
Mhm.
So, like, in organizations, for example, like, it used to be really effective and efficient for everybody to think the same way. If everybody's swimming in the same stream, then we're all happy and we can align around our mission, our values, et cetera. But now every single person, whether they travel or not, are swimming in different streams.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's actually impossible to get people back into the same stream. And so, on the topic of connection, one of the first things that I assume about everybody that I talk to is that they live in a different world they swim in a different ocean than I do. Right. So I'm not saying, hey, what's the basis of connection, but also, like, what ocean are you swimming in on a regular basis? And
Yep.
where do our river or waters overlap,
Mhm.
because that's not something you could take for granted in a way you could have 10 or 15 years ago, or even two.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Now, I think identifying that is powerful, but I'm curious to hear about how you bring these things together. Like, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like, and I have experienced this. It sounds like we've grown not apart, but grown aware in our different options of thinking and ways of thinking, and everyone is kind of all over the place. How do we get things? How do we get connection between that, and how do we get things aligned in the workplace? Let's say a place where there is so much, even more so, spread out.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, like the short answer is differently. Like, I remember, early pandemic, there used to be this language. Do you remember this term, new normal?
Oh yeah. Oh
Right.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Where it's like, yeah. Like, we're all going to adapt to this, and then we're going to just get to a new normal. And the assumption is, like, I'm a storyteller, so just to use a storytelling phrase, happily ever after. Right? If we just get through this last problem, there will be no problems ever again, and we're all going to live happily ever after. And I mean, that sounds absurd, but that really is the prevailing thinking even today among a mainstream of business leaders. Right? It's just like, if we can just solve this final problem, then our flywheel will run and we will be just smooth sailing for a long time. And, like, one of the things that I say to clients all the time in my sales pitch is, like, I said this to you the other day, right? Like, I don't solve your problems, I make your problems worse.
Mhm.
And in this regard, I say, hey, things are never going to be normal again. And so the question, when you're asking a question like, well, yeah, everyone's kind of out in their separate things, but how do we align people
Mhm.
and bring them back? The short answer is, we can't. So we have to take a way different attitude to how we communicate, how we manage, how we sell, how we orient our organizations. Like, this is like a cat out of the bag. We're in a totally different operating environment, even though the vast majority of organizations still think that one day we're going to reconcile back to new normal.
Mhm.
And I mean, just to give you a perfect example, the work from home problem.
Mhm.
Like, in January 2020, there was a small number of people out there who did Zoom. right? Or who worked on teams, or who had these
Yeah.
kinds of, and overnight, the whole world learned how to do this thing that fundamentally shifted the office experience.
Mm-hmm.
But now for us to say, oh, yeah, you did that for a couple of years, but now that's done, we're going to go back to normal. It denies something really fundamental for people about how we can work. So rather than seeing this as like an opportunity for innovation, where it's like, okay, well, we've been different, so how do we do this differently?
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of, the instinct is to go back into this like align, conserve, control methodology. And I think that is what over the medium term is going to prove to be, it's going to fall apart more.
Mm-hmm.
We're not
Mm-hmm.
going to be able to go back to the way that things were. So the only other alternative is to look forward.
Yeah, and that's a tough pill, I think, for some people to swallow, right? Like that is a harsh reality. Hearing that. And I think it's interesting too, like I think there's a lot of organizations operating almost 3 feet ahead of themselves. Like they're not fully there with what's happening. It's like you said, it's like, let's get to this point and then we'll be good. Let's get to that point and then we're good. But very rarely do we see the scenario where people are fully there in the moment, embracing these changes, embracing the current states, and really accepting and allowing that for what it is, and then kind of being willing to pivot accordingly. People are we're always like I said, 3 feet ahead. It seems that's something I've noticed as well, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts or maybe observations you've noticed in the workplace right now.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. And part of it, like compassionately, part of it is that's the way that people were trained.
Yeah.
When I think about what I was taught in business school 20 years ago, like everything was about managerial control, right? Like what can we understand? What's best practice? What's the most reasonable next step? Like that is the prevailing education through business school, even today.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people are confronted with these kinds of massive disruptions like COVID, like, war settings, like all the stuff that's happening in the world, everyone's instinct is, yeah, but what can I control? And so it's a much different way of thinking to stop, to step back, and to be like, okay, like, what does this make possible? How can we be different? How can we rewire the foundation of the organization? Like, I think that opens up much bigger and scarier questions for people
Yeah.
than just like, okay, well, like, how do I just get through, the next 10 minutes or the next 3 days or the next 3 months?
Mm-hmm.
Again, just to be clear, I'm not saying people are wrong or stupid for doing that,
Mm-hmm.
but it makes sense why they're doing it. But the trouble is that doing that over and over again is never going to get in front of the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're always going to be caught up in this reactive cycle.
Yep.
Like something happens and then you're back in the something again,
Mm-hmm.
rather than being able to be like, okay, like how do I actually, I would say, transcend the problem in some way so I can get to a different set of choices or different set of strategies or tactics around that.
Mm-hmm.
Like to just give you a very practical example,
Yeah.
like in tech sales, for example,
Yep.
there was movement over the last 10 years away from selling product to consultative sales.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So what is consultative sales? Well, consultative sales means literally going in and being a consultant for somebody where you're helping them assess, fix their problems, see potentialities that they couldn't have seen before. That's way different from selling features and benefits,
Totally.
And so somebody who is still selling features and benefits will never be able to do consultative sales because they're just dressed up in the consultative sales clothing, but they're still selling the product,
And I see a lot of that. I think that's the hardest thing that I've seen currently is there's a lot of people dressed up that they're keeping up with the new, and it's like, okay, we got to be consultants now, but they're not truly bought in to that for what that means. And it's not true pain discovery. It's still coming back to you as the seller. And there's a guy, a mentor of mine. He's part of the team that co-founded the concept of the inner game, and the inner game of selling is his basically his principle. And one line in that is, it's not about the seller, it's about the buyer. And always remembering that it doesn't matter how well you sell. It matters, at the end of the day, if they're buying. So that comes down to, and a lot of his work is mindfulness based around awareness and presence of listening to the pain, listening to the problem, and only saying what is necessary, like a consultant would. It's not about you or your product or you trying to get the deal done. And that shift for me was really, really powerful. But I still find organizations not fully understanding what it means to be a consultant. I still think there is a lot of like, here's our product, here's why you should buy, even though they're in that clothing of the consultant. I see that a lot.
And I would say like even consultants don't know what it's like to be consultants.
Yeah, I guess what is a consultant? No, but
but just to say, actually, like let me make a point on
yeah.
what you're saying, which is like, if the problem in the world is reactivity, I'm constantly in the cycle of 3 months, I'm just solving problems, fighting fires, then the solution has got to be vision, right? And by that, I mean, how do I get beyond these fires to a different state, right? And so as a consultant, part of what I sell is vision, right? Which is like, I'm actually going to help you figure out what it means to be a visionary, and I'll inform some of that so that you can go to your clients and sell vision to them. Not necessarily my vision, but at least my diagnosis of what I think is wrong in the world. Because if you're just recycling the shit that you read online, like everybody gets the same stuff in their inbox.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But somewhere, somehow you have to find something that no one else is saying, because that is what makes it you valuable. Not just in the solution, but your ability to defend the solution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think vision also, I'll never forget, this is kind of a hard derail, but I'll link it back in. But I was in Brazil at that time, and I was with my host family, and I'm like, why is there a church in every corner, yet there's people on the streets starving? Why can't we use some of that money, maybe put a church on every other corner and put it into, housing and do this? And my host father replied, because the church brings hope and people like hope. And that really hit me. And I think a vision also provides hope. And I think that's really important. People need that. And I think when they're not forced, but allowed to see that, really good things happen. So I really like that vision piece.
And I think you're bang on it. I mean, like, let's diagnose the problem in the world. It's hopelessness.
Yeah.
Like, who feels optimistic about the future in light of war, climate change, COVID, like AI, like you name your bad guy. And like everybody's got something to fear about, like we live in Vancouver, and in Vancouver, the massive fear is I won't be able to afford a house. I'll be kicked out of the city, and I mean, lots of different cities have their own version of these different things. So like the prevailing emotional temperature of this time is hopelessness. And the antidote to hopelessness is hope. Now, I'm not saying false hope, right? And so this is where it becomes very nuanced and complex. Like, but I really do think that the challenge for any of us and for all of us is like, how do you find hope in these times? Hope in your business, hope in yourself, hope in your community, because, to put it crassly, that's what people need. That's what's going to sell. And if you're just selling a solution that's not actually hopeful, it just is perpetuating, perpetuating the problem.
Yeah. And I was just going to say as well, I think like the sales world, I'll go out and say, is a little bit broken right now in terms of how, again, going back to like the sales professional might be listening to this, like expectations are growing, team sizes are reducing. It is a really crazy time to be a quote unquote seller or sales professional right now. And a lot of that hope has been removed, for sales professionals. They're not even seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. It's very much this road of hopelessness that a lot of people are on. And I hear that a lot in the coaching when I'm speaking with sales professionals. And a lot of them are talking about how exactly that they feel lost. They feel like they're not valued. And I think for any leaders listening, like this is an amazing opportunity for you to recreate that hope, because right now when you're team is feeling that hopelessness over an extended period of time, as you know, that's going to lead to all kinds of bad things like turnover and burnout and all these things that at the end of the day be a problem for the organization. So I think that's really relevant also to sales professionals in the day-to-day right now.
And also just figuring out, I mean, not just the only word, I agree with everything you said, but
Yeah.
the only word I take issue with is recreate,
Yeah.
right? Which is like what I would actually say is find, because
Mm-hmm.
hope is somewhere out there in here, wherever it is.
Mm-hmm.
But if you, me, if one doesn't know how to find that hope in ourselves, we're never going to be able to find inspiration, motivation, persuasion in someone else. It's all going to be just like manipulation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Actually, when people feel hope, like to the point of your Brazilian host father,
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
people feel hope, they will do the wildest things, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
and I think like that actually is genuine motivation. People who can motivate and inspire hope inside of someone or inside of an organization, like not only do those people get paid a lot of money,
Mm-hmm.
but those people can actualize a ton of change.
Mm-hmm.
Because now you're not just like providing a solution. Like I go to McDonald's, not that I really go to McDonald's, but you know what I mean. Like I'm not asking for hope with my quarter pounder. I just want the execution of the solution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? But if I go to a high-end restaurant, part of what they're selling is the higher order emotions of
Mm-hmm.
experience and fulfillment and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think if I'm a sales professional today, I'm looking at the landscape and I'm saying, if I'm just focused on executional communication, AI is going to come for me so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But the
Mm-hmm.
thing AI can never do is inspire, motivate, hope at a real level. So I have to figure out how to do that, because if I don't, I'm dead.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And I think also kind of taking this opportunity for, again, a lot of the audience listening to take the time to go inward and not just blame it on the system and this structure being quote unquote broken. It's taking the time to do the work to make sure that you are able to approach this in your best state and in a way of being able to adapt and be flexible, kind of the stuff that we were referring to earlier. Like this is an amazing opportunity for you to also put the work in yourself and go inward, because that it does start there. You have to also make sure that you're putting yourself in the best position to show up every day. And that's something I've also found is like a lot of people aren't doing that. They're just kind of blaming it on this and that, and they're not taking this time to look inward and check in with the work they've done to make sure that they're putting themselves, with their best foot forward.
You're absolutely right. And I think what I would say to people like that is, in 5 or 10 years, it's going to be so obvious that this is just part of what day-to-day business is like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think for like, we're in this transition period, not to the new normal, but everybody in the world, you go to the World Economic Forum, you go to any of these major people and you ask like, what's the future of work? Everybody says adaptability, resilience, communication, connection, everybody, right? But what we're learning right now is that the old ways of organizing work don't create those outcomes. And so the whole workforce, the whole economy is going to move and is moving through this transition where we actually are going to ask ourselves, okay, if the highest value I can provide to my organization is adaptability, then what does adaptability require? Is it remote work? Is it, 4-day work weeks? Is it I take 3 months off to backpack every year? Is it, is it the whole company shuts down every day for an hour and we all meditate? Like I said at the beginning, my giveaway is it depends. But everybody is going to have at least some version of this practice, because otherwise, not only will you burn out, but you won't be able to deliver what work demands tomorrow, which is innovation, creativity, dynamism, adaptability. The old way of structuring work can't hold those things. Does that make sense?
It hits home so much for me because I experienced that. I realized I wasn't doing those things. And quite honestly, it forced me to kind of hit rock bottom with all that in terms of like just a really low point in my life to start giving a shit and starting to put the work into that. I wish it didn't have to go to that point. I wish I had known sooner. now I feel very called to help equip sales professionals with those tools to navigate that because of kind of what I went through with that. So it makes so much sense. And I think that that is the new the future that we will see. We're starting to hopefully see more and more traction regarding
Yeah.
that.
I mean, two things. I mean, like one is it's not even hope in this regard because it's just so like this is what's coming, whether you
Yeah.
like it or not, whether you think it's fluffy woo-woo bullshit or not. Like this is what's coming. Your job, no matter what you do, is to be adaptable because we live in the most volatile economy, in the most volatile political social context in the history of history, you know? And so like, what do my customers need in order to feel safe, to feel understood, to feel supported in this environment? Like, that's the question that we all have to answer, you know, because if we can't answer that question, or if we answer it in a way that is formulaic, like someone else is going to do it better because adaptability by definition cannot be formulaic,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we all have got to kind of figure out a way to kind of operate in this new arena. And I think like when you start to go down this rabbit hole, you can see like the whole economy, the whole way we structure organizations, the whole way we think about business is going to change. And again, just to be clear, I'm not saying should change. This isn't like what I think. This is like the writing is very clearly on the wall and it's already happening. The question for all of us is like, how do we move from that old into the new way of being? And so the second thing I want to pick on that I think you're absolutely right about is that hitting a wall breakdown moment. And I think like the really sad reality, and I mean, I've experienced this too, you know, is like in order to go from one paradigm to another, you have to break down. And like I think that's like an eternal, I'm going to say spiritual truth, which is actually the worst thing to say, you know, because it's like being in a bad relationship where you're like, I'm trying, and then bam, you hit the wall. And then later you can look back and say, oh, I missed all of these things. There's going to be, and there even needs to be these kinds of like rock bottom moments that end what somebody was doing before and start something new. And I think that's part of what's so terrifying for all of us is no one wants to hit rock bottom, right?
No, I mean society has still programmed us to think that failure is a bad thing. We're scared to fail, we're scared to not succeed. And when we do not, we are very hard on ourselves. That's a whole nother thing. But I think that that concept of failing and hitting rock bottom and building and discovering and these things, we still haven't created that container where that's totally acceptable. And I think getting comfortable with failure is a huge piece of that too.
I agree. I mean, for me, like I was doing these storytelling workshops. I did them for
Yeah,
you.
yeah, they're amazing. Yeah.
But I was doing them, you know, 2017, 2018, 2019. I was traveling all over the world. I was delivering this content. When the pandemic started, I canceled, you know, 6 months worth of work. My revenue went down 75% those first couple of years.
Jeez.
Right.
Yeah.
And like I wasn't making enough money to be able to survive in Vancouver on
Mm-hmm.
25% revenue of what I was originally making. And I found that experience so, I mean, not just humbling, but humiliating to a certain degree, because there's this thing that I was pretty good at doing that
Yeah.
suddenly I didn't do anymore. And so people would ask me, you know, like 2021, early 2022, what do you do for work? And my answer honestly was like, I don't even know anymore because I had done this thing, but then I had hit my own version of rock bottom within the kind of larger COVID narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just so fundamentally lost. And you know, it fucking sucked. Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I
And
appreciate you being honest with that as well. I appreciate that vulnerability there. Continue.
yeah, yeah. And it catalyzed new thinking, which led to a new way that I package my services and all of those kinds of things. And, you know, like I'm coming out of that and it's still not necessarily what it was back then. And like the inner shift that all of this kind of catalyzed, meaning like the shift in the way that I think of myself actually has proven to be the most rewarding outcome of all of that. And I never would have even come close to touching that kind of stuff had I just been doing, you know, running this successful business. you know? And like, if you had asked me at the time, do you want to hit a wall and break down? Like the answer would have been absolutely fucking not, you know?
Yeah, yeah. No,
And
yeah.
and now looking back, I can say like what happened for me was quote unquote the best thing, you know? And so both of those things are true at the same time. I never would have wanted this to happen. And it's been the best thing for happening.
I relate to that 100%. I wouldn't be here right now going all in on my work had that not have happened. I just wouldn't. I'd probably just be doing another job that isn't necessarily aligned with what I want to be or what I am, and I would have just continued in that. And had that not have happened, it wouldn't have forced me to do the scary thing of being an entrepreneur and coaching sales professionals and creating a brand. Like, it's scary shit, but now I'm at the point where I don't have a choice. I have no choice but to do this. This is where I'm at right now, and that just keeps me going every day. I'm so sure that this is what I need to do, that this is what I'm meant to do, that I don't have a choice with it anymore.
And I would say, Damien, like that, what you're describing is, in my language, I would call that conviction,
Yeah.
right? And somebody, you know, in the realm of sales professionals, somebody with conviction is a great salesperson
Mm-hmm.
because it's not bullshit. They're actually, you know, like you believe in what you're doing, and somebody else on the other side of that, on the other side of the phone, on the other side of the table, on the other side of Zoom, can feel that. And
Mm-hmm.
that, even if you're saying the same words, the conviction comes through, I would say even louder than the words.
That's
You know,
powerful.
yeah, like that's the business case, quote unquote, for doing this kind of inner development work. Is like, you can read all the books about how to sell, you can, you know, master your elevator pitch, but it all is a certain level of bullshit until you find the conviction inside of yourself and the genuine, you know, I'm going to say desire to help, but it doesn't have to be, you know, it doesn't have to be charitable. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I still want to make a lot of money off of you, but if I'm coming at it from an angle where my conviction is um, audible and
Mm-hmm.
experienced by the other person, it's going to be way more effective than if I just kind of say the right things without actually believing in it. You know, there's this really loaded word out there, charisma. You know, like we all want charisma, and none of us know how to develop charisma, because you can read all the books, how to win friends and influence people, or, you know,
Yep.
whatever, you know, whoever else is saying. But actually, like this moment that we're talking about of hitting the wall, breaking down, and then deciding somehow that this is the path I'm going to be, like I'm going to go on, that is the path towards charisma, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a hard, challenging, but infinitely rewarding path. It's not just like, here's the top 5 steps to win friends and sell more, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. That, oh man, so much wisdom. Every time you speak, there's takeaways. I know listeners will be having a lot of takeaways from this conversation. So I guess just beginning to wrap up here, what is your current offering? What is kind of the work you're doing? What is the current Jordan right now?
Yeah, so my work since this kind of death and rebirth that I've talked about
Yes.
is much more in the realm of organizational consulting.
Okay.
You know, I founded a business coming out of this. The business is called Rocket Science,
Nice.
right?
Okay.
Yeah, because actually it is rocket science. And really, it's about helping organizations bring in greater adaptability and greater creativity and innovation into the way that they operate, meaning at the level of their DNA, not just as a bunch of trainings and courses. And so recently, my clients have been, you know, executive level folks who are looking at sophisticated and complex problems and asking themselves, how do I find different thinking here? Not just best practice, but how do I invent the next best practice? And so the services I provide there, like, you know, it at some level, it's very similar to coaching, or I joke that I'm a corporate therapist, in that it's not just that the leader is my client, but the whole organizational system is my client. And I analyze, like looking at the whole organization, you know, lie the organization down on the couch. What parts are working? What's not working? What are the behaviors that are inhibiting creativity, adaptability, et cetera? And what would be required to change some of those behaviors? So it's like moving an entire organization through an upgrade.
Wow. So needed, and I'm sure you'll be very, very busy in the very near future based on what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
I think also right now I'm like a year or two just a bit ahead of things. So when I still say this, people are like, what the fuck are you talking about?
But I think you're starting to see, I even feel the same way with a lot of the work that I'm doing around, kind of the inner game of selling. People are like, what are you talking about with that?
Mm.
And it's just the reality. Maybe it is a little bit ahead, but I think that'll also come with a lot of benefits for you as well. So
I mean,
yeah.
it's similar because when I was doing these workshops on storytelling, I would do a day or two, people would have a nice experience. And at the end, the aha would be like, well, how do we become better storytellers in a word practice?
Mhm.
Right. So that means that we have to walk away and carve out an hour, 5 hours, whatever it is on a regular basis for us to practice the skill so that it can slowly build over time. And that actually is the catalyst or potential catalyst to an organizational change. If you're the kind of organization that just wants to like bring somebody in, read a book, and then have everybody do that, like that's just not realistic anymore.
Mm-mm.
I think like even back then I started to have a sense for, this is a bigger thing. But I was really scared back in those days to be that honest to an organizational leader. Like I came in to think if like I think I did a full day or a half day workshop.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's great, but like, how is this actually going to make a difference in 2 weeks?
Mhm.
It's going to need a more significant organizational change. And I didn't even know how to say that to somebody back then.
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
much more confident saying that because it's actually the truth.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That's powerful. And I think for anyone listening, I'll include your information in the show notes as well. If anyone wants to reach out to you, um, what is the best through email, LinkedIn? What's the best way to get a hold of
Yeah,
you?
LinkedIn is great. Or also I have a website. My website's jordanbauer.com. So you can put
Okay.
that in things.
Yeah.
And I'm really happy to talk to folks, but especially I'd love to talk to leadership
Hmm.
because, if anybody who's thinking about what does the sales team of the future look like and what do we need to do as an organization to prepare for that? That's the question that I can help people solve.
Oh man, that is so needed, especially, from a CRO or VP of sales that's moving quickly in this tech ecosystem right now. So that's amazing.
Right.
Cool. All right. Always a pleasure, Jordan. We'll talk soon. Appreciate you.
Thanks so much, Damien. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, talk soon.